Well, everybody quieted down. It must be time to start. Good morning. My name is Jim Ogsbury, and I'm the Executive Director of the Western Governors Association. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to beautiful Helena, Montana, for a workshop of the Western Governors Biosecurity and Invasive Species Initiative. It's the signature policy effort of WGA's chairman, the Honorable David Ige, the Governor of Hawaii. Western governors are unique among American political leaders. They are pragmatic and practical and collegial, and they're focused on confronting challenges and solving problems. Accordingly, what distinguishes WGA is a fierce commitment to bipartisanship and an orientation toward action. Many governors attest that WGA is their favorite gubernatorial association. Almost all would concede that it's the most effective at actually getting things done. And WGA derives a great deal of its energy on policy work from the initiative of its leadership and its chairman. Efforts such as the Biosecurity and Invasive Species Initiative, for which we are gathered here today, give the governors an opportunity and a mechanism to assemble experts and stakeholders to examine critical regional issues from multiple angles, to identify potential solutions, to develop policy recommendations, and to produce and implement action plans. And ultimately, that's why we're here today, and why your participation is so important and so significant. The goal of this workshop is not to have just another conversation on invasives. It's not to produce a report or a video, and nobody's here to get a photo op or acquire more frequent flyer miles. We're here to drive toward affirmative, positive action. We are here to devise and lay the groundwork for on-the-ground solutions to the scourge of invasive species in the West. Because as we have seen time and again, no one is more capable than Western governors to approach land management challenges in a methodical, practical, effective, and bipartisan way. This is the third in a series of workshops on invasive species. These fresh discussions have brought more public attention to this important issue, and they fostered the collaboration necessary for different players from different disciplines and with different responsibilities to work together on this problem. The first initiative workshop was held in September at Lake Tahoe, where Nevada Governor Brian Sandoval led a conversation on cross-boundary management and the prevention, management, and control of established species. This was followed in October by the WGA Working Lands Roundtable hosted by Wyoming Governor Matt Mead in Cheyenne. The roundtable represents WGA's new effort to assemble leaders in land management and to examine cross-cutting and interrelated policy issues, such as invasive species and drought and endangered species, insect and disease, wildfire. The October roundtable featured a number of panels dedicated to Governor Ige's initiative on invasives, as well as related panels on these other sticky and inextricably linked issues. Today's initiative workshop focuses on early detection and rapid response, key elements of the fight against invasive species in the West. We've gathered some of the region's foremost experts on aquatic and terrestrial invasive species for a discussion of how state and federal and tribal agencies can better collaborate and coordinate when new invasive species are detected. We're also going to examine new and innovative technical tools and best practices for invasive species control. Today's conversation will be followed by a workshop on December 9th and 10th on the Big Island of Hawaii. That workshop is going to be focused on biosecurity and agriculture, and that precedes the WGA Invasive Mussels Leadership Forum scheduled for January 30th and 31st in Denver. In early 2019, we'll conduct a series of webinars on discrete invasive species issues, and we expect to publish a first-year report on the Biosecurity and Invasive Species Initiative in connection with the WGA summer meeting in Vail, Colorado, scheduled for June 10th through 12th. I want to take just a minute to thank our federal partners for their support of this initiative. In particular, the U.S. Department of the Interior and its Bureau of Reclamation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and its Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. I don't know that the governors have many more higher priorities than improving the state-federal relationship. It's something that we work on all day and every day. And I think that this initiative and the federal partners' participation in this initiative go a long way in reconstructing that relationship and really developing a new paradigm to improve state-federal collaboration. So thank you very much. And thank you all for participating in this expansive effort. Working together, I know from experience that we can make magic happen. And before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to remind you that this workshop is being live streamed to reach a broad universe of people interested in this topic. So for the benefit of our live stream audience, when you're asking a question, please remember to share your name and affiliation and speak directly into the microphone. Our moderator, Leah Elwell, is the incoming executive director of the Invasive Species Action Network, a Montana-based nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing the human-caused spread of invasive species. Leah, who's been working on this issue for nearly 20 years, collaborates with partners across the West to improve management protocols, expand outreach efforts, and strengthen working relationships. I'm pleased to present Leah to launch our workshop and moderate our first panel, Rapid Response for New Species and Disease Detections. Leah. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. So my job here is to keep this show moving forward. So today we have an incredible lineup of knowledgeable people that will share information with us, provide us with food for thought, and also give us some insight on early detection and rapid response. And with that information, hopefully feed into the ideas of how it fits into decision making. So to go over sort of the ground rules that we'll be using here today, each of these panels is for at least an hour, and during that time period, each of the panelists will provide a 5-minute overview that relates to the topic we will be discussing. Then I, as the moderator, will pose specific questions to our panelists, and then, if time permits, we will open the floor to the audience for specific questions. We know we have a lot of expertise and other information that can be shared from the breadth of this room, and we want to be able to capture that as well. So if you do have a question, you will, during that time period, you will need to raise your hand and then use the microphone, as we've discussed, to make sure our live streaming audience can also hear and participate in that. So with that, I would like to invite our first panelists up here to the stage, and then I will introduce them. So we have John Vore, the Game Management Bureau Chief with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks; Gary Adams, the Montana State Plant Health Director with USDA APHIS; John Atwood, the Invasive Species Coordinator with Hawaii Invasive Species Council; and then finally Hans Bodenhamer, with the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto. Great. Okay, so this panel, we'll start with rapid response for new species and disease detections, funding, authorities, and collaboration. And I would first like to allow John Vore to address the group. Thank you, John.
Good morning. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to Helena, Montana, my hometown. Great place to be here. I'm glad that you're here. I'm going to talk a little bit about CWD. Montana It was unexpected, or it was expected, but we were still disappointed that we became one of the states that now has CWD. Among the, I think there's now 26 states, 3 provinces, a couple other countries that have CWD. And of course, CWD is a huge concern to anybody that has an interest in wildlife. We know from the sad experience in other states and provinces that it can have a very serious effect on game populations, on deer and elk, moose populations. It only affects those species of the deer family, but those, of course, are very important to not only our economy, but our culture, everything that's associated with Montana. When many people think of Montana, they think of the wildlife that we have here, and we very highly value that. We were very lucky in that we had a very good place to start from here in Montana. We have always emphasized management for opportunity, which meant that we allow people to harvest, in many cases, either sex of deer, which meant that we had lower buck-doe ratios than many other states have. We still have some very nice buck deer in Montana, but we have emphasized that opportunity, which put us in a good place, because we know that buck deer are 2 to 3 times more likely to be infected and to spread it on the landscape. So the management of Montana wildlife for decades has put us in a good place to deal with it now that we have it. Moreover, we were in a good place in that back in 2000 or 1999, there was a voter initiative that outlawed any new game farms in Montana. We do have, there's 29 game farms or alternative livestock facilities in the state. Only 21 of those have any cervids. That put us in a very good place. I was at a recent media conference of states. Some of our sister states, for example, Pennsylvania has over 1,000 of those alternative livestock facilities, and those can be sources for CWD infection in wild animals. So we are very lucky in that way. Also, we knew that we had our we were surrounded on 3 sides by states and provinces that had CWD, some of those very close. So we knew it was only a matter of time until we found it, and we were going to start looking for it seriously. With that in mind, we set out to put together a plan to deal with it once we found it. We put together a plan to look for it, how we were going to effectively look for it, how we were going to deal with it once we found it. And we started that about 2 years ago before we found it. That plan was put together by a 15-member internal Fish, Wildlife, and Parks personnel that consisted of not only biologists, but game wardens, communication and education staff, those kinds of things. We also had a 12-member citizens panel, which was very important. We looked for citizens from across the state, so we had a good geographic spread of citizens. Also people with a broad background in disease and disease spread, those kinds of things. We were fortunate in that we had some very knowledgeable people, one of whom was Dr. Brent Race from the National Health Institute here in Hamilton, Montana, who was working just on prion diseases. And so we were very lucky to have him. Both of those entities, both of those panels or committees put together this plan. The plan went through 20 drafts, if you will. It was a long time in coming, but it was very good that we had that in place for when we found it. Interestingly, on the day that I was presenting that draft plan to our Fish and Wildlife Commission, I had just finished presenting the plan to the commission, turned around to take my seat, and my boss, who was the next person up to the podium, handed me a little note. When I got back to my seat, I looked at the little note. Whoop, we found CWD. And so right away, right after the commission meeting, we adjourned to Director Williams' office and put the plan into action, even though it was in draft form. So we were very lucky that we had a good plan in place that we were able to put into action. The plan itself was put together, as I mentioned, by internal staff and also with the Citizens Advisory Committee, if you will, but also with staff from Department of Livestock and Department of Public Health and Human Safety here in Montana, because we knew that those entities and the things that they oversee would be important in not only looking for CWD, but responding to it. And so we were in a good place to deal with it. We have now been finding it in more places in the state, unsurprisingly, but we're still disappointed in that. But it has put us in a good place to deal with it. We've had one of the most important parts of the plan, as with anything, is our communication and public outreach. We knew from the very get-go that that would be the most important part of the plan. If you don't have people that understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, you're not going to have support to move forward with it. We've seen that in other states where they've lost public support for managing CWD. Consequently, proper management actions have been thwarted there. So we have spent a lot of time front-loading people with what CWD is, the danger that it poses to our wildlife here in Montana, and citing the research that we have from other states and provinces now that show that there can be significant declines in populations because of CWD, how it's spread, those kinds of things. And we continue those efforts even today. So it's very important that the management, the communication management is an important part of that plan, and indeed is a separate chapter all in and of itself in the plan. So I guess with that, I don't know where I am time-wise, but
Right on time.
right on time. There you go.
Perfect.
Good. I'm done then.
Thank you, John. And just for clarification purposes, CWD, for those that are unaware, is chronic wasting disease. Okay, so now we are going to hear from Gary Adams with USDA APHIS. Gary, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Leah. It's a pleasure being with such a distinguished bunch here today. I appreciate that. I'm the State Plant Health Director for the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service Plant Protection and Quarantine. There's a mouthful. You'll hear us referred to as APHIS. I am particularly focused on the plant health side of APHIS. There's also animal health issues with veterinary services. We also have wildlife services that deals with human and wildlife conflicts, such as wild hog issues. And I think John Steiber will be on a panel later this afternoon. And but my specific role is about dealing with plant health issues. And if you have, I'll take just a step back here a little bit. If everybody has been watching the news at all, you'll see that there's a great deal of issues regarding wildland fires in California right now. It's very devastating. And one thing that the firefighting community has learned from years past is that working together and building a common communication theme and not overstepping authorities and boundaries and working together, you can get a lot more done, be a lot more efficient when you fight a fire. The same thing applies in an invasive species introduction and response, is that it's just like a fire. You have an introduction just like a lightning strike. The fire grows, the population of that invasive species grows, and we want to respond to it effectively. And the way that we do that is by the use of the incident command system. I think most people in this room are familiar with that, but I see my friend Steve here, he's nodding. He's a big proponent of that as a firefighter, wildland firefighter in central Montana. And you can apply it to almost anything. And what it does is the incident command system, or ICS, I will use that acronym instead of speaking that out every time, focuses on a common set of communications where we're all speaking the same language. Like John alluded to, they had a plan in place for CWD, and as soon as it broke out, they implemented their plan. And when you have a variety of stakeholders that are involved in a new plant health emergency, you want to all be speaking the same language, and ICS allows us to do that. It creates a little bit of order where there's chaos, and probably more important than anything that they wanted us to talk about as part of this panel is the build of partnerships. And we cannot do anything. You can't do it. USDA, APHIS can't do it. None of us can do it alone. We have to build these partnerships. And ICS allows us to pull those partnerships together and work under one infrastructure. I'm wearing a shirt here that says the Incident Management Team, and I was part of a national incident management team for 12 years. I recently stepped down from that role, but it was a lot of challenges from a Mexican fruit fly on the Mexican border to with a coconut rhinoceros beetle in Hawaii to Asian longhorn beetle in Boston. And the situations and the partnerships and the infrastructures for each one of those emergencies and responses were very, very different. And ICS allows, no matter what the partnerships are, allows you to come together and work as one team. I'll just share a little bit that APHIS's other role is that we have a professional development center that provides training on ICS and through tabletop exercises, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises. And in Montana, they've come and done one for the aquatics program last year. No, that was, we worked with the Disaster and Emergency Services of Montana for the aquatics, and then PPQ came and helped with the tabletop exercise with tree pests. And really, rather than focusing on the getting down into the weeds of the biology of each of those pests, we talked about how do you respond in an ICS structure, how do you work with each other, how do you communicate effectively with each other, and we focused on those things. Veterinary Services, who deals with the mad cow disease, BSE, foot and mouth disease, avian influenza, any number of livestock diseases. They have, I think, 5 or 6 incident management teams that respond similarly to what PPQ does for the plant health emergency, and I think Wildlife Services even has some that are set up to respond on behalf of the local partners that we have. And I'll touch a little bit on some local partnerships, but I know that Josh is going to talk specifically about how they do that in Hawaii, and I don't want to hit on that. But our primary partners, because we're a regulatory agency and emergency response agency for the USDA, are the state plant regulatory officials in the states. The National Plant Board, we got Helmut over here, he can weigh in on that. But we have, one of the things that we do up front is we have memorandums of understanding with the state departments of agriculture, and that allows us to work under each other's authorities. It allows us to identify what kind of data can be shared, and it allows us to, where the feds can only establish quarantine boundaries on a state level, the states can do it on a smaller level, which is less impactful to the stakeholders that are involved in any kind of a regulatory action. So we work on having that set up front. We have MOUs that we work with our tribal partners. They're a sovereign nation. In Montana, tribal partners are huge. They're part of our Invasive Species Council, official members of our Montana Invasive Species Council. So we try to get that, figure that up front. And without stepping on Josh's feet, the non-governmental agencies, and maybe the Hawaii Invasive Species Council is a government agency. I don't know. I'll let you describe that. But when we worked on coconut rhinoceros beetle, we worked with the Oahu Invasive Species Council, and Christy's over there ignoring me, but can you raise your hand? Yeah, okay, so if everybody, when I shook Christy's hand this morning, it was cold, and it was her birthday yesterday, so if everyone could wish Christy a happy birthday today and shake her hand until that hand is warm, I think we'll give her a good Montana welcome to that. The only other thing that they asked me to talk about just a little bit was funding, and I'll just go over that a little bit, is that the USDA does have appropriations for a lot of emergency responses, some of the programs that happen time and again, some of our fruit fly issues, but there are a few mechanisms by which we can request additional funding for emergencies, and that starts with the Plant Protection Act I had to write this down, Section 7721, which used to be part of the Farm Bill, Section 10007, but it's now in our Plant Protection Act. And then the Commodity Credit Corporation is another way that we can, get unexpected funding for an emergency for a new plant pest outbreak, which wasn't anticipated. But that's kind of a laborious process, and we really try to work within our budget when we can. And I will leave it at that, just trying to plug that everybody in this room commit to understanding how to spell ICS, knowing what ICS stands for, and then if you're going to be part of any response, to try to incorporate yourself into that infrastructure so that we're all working together in a partnership. Thanks, Leah.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. All right, next we will hear from Josh Atwood, Invasive Species Coordinator with Hawaii Invasive Species Council.
All right, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank WGA for all the work they're doing to support Governor Ige's Biosecurity and Invasive Species Initiative. For those who don't know, we have a relatively new biosecurity plan in Hawaii that is pretty closely tied to the scope and goals of the WGA initiative. It's largely a capacity resource strategic plan for trying to rise all boats with a single tide. And so a lot of the knowledge gaps in there, we really appreciate WGA providing input from other states so that we can learn how everybody else is doing this important work. So I'm the coordinator for the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. I work at the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources as their invasive species coordinator, and as part of my role there, I work on this interagency council. And I think several of the Western states have invasive species councils that are government entities. They combine the authorities and the expertise of multiple government agencies. What makes us relatively unique amongst those other groups, we are established in statute, which really helps when you have to do regulatory action. And then we also have funding tied to the Invasive Species Council in Hawaii. And so we get an annual appropriation from our state legislature that we use not to boost the programs of the core 6 agencies that comprise the Invasive Species Council, but to support year-to-year gap-filling projects. There are a lot of important biosecurity gaps in between, say, what the Hawaii Department of Agriculture does for agricultural inspection at our borders, and what the Department of Land and Natural Resources does for resource protection, largely in our montane areas. So there's this really important area between establishment or introduction and then establishment in natural areas that we try to address through these unique partnerships. And I think that those partnerships are largely what helps Hawaii deal with some of our unique problems for early detection and rapid response. I'm going to talk about a few of them today. I have a couple of slides I brought with me. And so basically the first one here just shows kind of our structure. So we have 6 agencies that comprise the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. I already mentioned the primary agencies, Land and Natural Resources and Agriculture. But we also deal with human health issues through our Department of Health, transportation issues through Department of Transportation. We have a unique one, business, economic development, and tourism. That's largely tied to our tourism industry, which is our primary driver in Hawaii, of course. And then the University of Hawaii is our primary academic research institution, of course, but what makes them really unique is their ability to support these year-to-year projects that I'm going to talk about. So HIS kind of expands beyond and fills the gaps between those agencies with that annual funding I talked about. And then I think I can, yep. So these are some of the examples of partnerships we support. The first I would mention is the Invasive Species Committees of Hawaii. So as Gary mentioned, the Oahu Invasive Species Committee is the group that he got to work with on the coconut rhinoceros beetle response. And these are year-to-year sort of semi-governmental partnerships where they are guided by input from regulatory agencies, but the staff are part of the university system. They're not tied to the restrictions that often come with regulatory agency actions. They're also much more closely related to community engagement than regulatory agencies can sometimes be, where in Hawaii and probably in a lot of the Western states, there's often some reticence from the public in working directly with the government. These invasive species committees are much more likely to be seen as part of the community. They're going to community fairs and taking calls directly from the public, going to private property to help respond to new detections. Similarly, the Hawaii Ant Lab is a partnership through the University of Hawaii that we support with Invasive Species Council funding. And that brings the world's foremost expert on little fire ants, which is our worst invasive ant in Hawaii that we're dealing with at the moment, to Hawaii. And they have a lab based in Hilo, but they work statewide and often region-wide, helping other Pacific Island jurisdictions with their invasive ant problems. And similar to the invasive species committees, they partner with regulatory agencies to enact private property access if needed, and to get guidance on how to best assist the state, but they are not a regulatory agency themselves. And the last partnership I want to mention is CGAPS, the Coordinating Group on Alien Pest Species, where the Invasive Species Council is a cabinet-level group that brings together agency heads. CGAPS brings together the management-level staff that are actually doing a lot of the work on the ground. And so they meet quarterly, and we get together and talk about what each partner is working on at the moment. And then it's also a great place to do proactive planning. The photo there is actually from a tabletop exercise we did for coconut rhinoceros beetle before it was detected in Hawaii. And so it was this chance for us to walk through a purely hypothetical exercise of what would we do and which agencies would fill what role if coconut rhinoceros beetle were to arrive in Hawaii. That was October 2013, and I think December of 2013 we actually had coconut rhinoceros beetle show up. We didn't follow our own tabletop plan perfectly, but I think it definitely helped that we had that kind of preparation in terms of thinking about how to deal with emergency response. And since this is one of the things that I think makes us fairly unique, I just want to reiterate how this works logistically. The partnerships are managed by committees, and so on the far left you see the mixture of agency representatives and other stakeholders. So for example, the Oahu Invasive Species Committee quarterly will get together, and there's a representative there from the Department of Land and Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture, the County Board of Water Supply, the local botanical garden, really any group that is a stakeholder and is willing to show up quarterly, we want their input. And so that committee provides oversight on what the group is doing in terms of early detection targets. And when there is an emergency response in the state, that the resource kind of shifts toward helping to deal with that problem. The financial management side of it, and again, this is kind of not that exciting, but I think it is important in terms of how we make this happen. It happens through the university as a project of a professor in the botany department through a cooperative studies unit we have there. So that provides oversight and staffing. It's a non-civil service function, and so they have a lot more flexibility to staff up and staff down. And the program is run by a manager that has a really dedicated field capacity through their field workers. They have data people, they have outreach people that do where our regulatory agencies tend to do the more formal news releases. The outreach people for our invasive species committees are the ones that are going to community events and doing a lot more of the on-the-ground face-to-face interactions with the community. And I think that's my last slide. So these groups, when there isn't an emergency response, they're working on their own list of early detection targets for each island. We have an invasive species committee in each county. And then when there is a new detection that is kind of all hands on deck, they're the most flexible groups where they can shift their work priorities for their current staff and then also add on additional capacity. A really good example is our recent response to rapid ohia death on the Big Island of Hawaii. Rapid ohia death is caused by a pair of fungi that are new species to the state. And it threatens ohia, which is a really important tree in our native forests. And so the response to this is really critical, but our regulatory agencies are kind of hamstrung when it comes to creating new capacity. Other than the Invasive Species Council funding, there's no dedicated pot of money that's set aside to deal with new detections. And the process of establishing new civil service positions takes a lot of time and commitment from the legislature. So if you're looking to do something really quickly, which if you're following the incident command structure, time is of the essence, these groups really come into play. So we have a field team on the Big Island that is dedicated to go out to look for new detections of this fungus. and then respond to those new detections. Most of that capacity is provided through the Big Island Invasive Species Committee. The actual ICS program is managed by the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, but almost all the new capacity that's been provided to deal with this issue is this non-civil service capacity through the university. So that has really helped us be more flexible for some of these responses. And part of our biosecurity plan is, certainly we need to increase the resources at our regulatory agencies so that we have the right expertise in place to guide a lot of these actions. But what we want to do is try to take this more flexible capacity that happens through the university and try to make that a bit more permanent without getting into the trappings of civil service requirements necessarily and some of the regulatory burdens that other agencies have. But we're starting to realize at the state level how important these partnerships are for flexibly responding to invasive species issues in Hawaii and trying to come up with some way to provide some programmatic stability for them in the long term, I think will really help as new detections keep occurring in Hawaii. So in addition to rabbit ohia deaths, some of the emergency responses that we're dealing with, as Gary mentioned, the coconut rhinoceros beetle response is now completing its 5th year of operation in Hawaii. They have successfully kept it contained to the southern portion of Oahu. It has a really broad host range, and so while it likes palm trees and could spread statewide on just that species alone, it also attacks a number of important agricultural crops and native species. And so we're really thankful that while we aren't quite done with coconut rhinoceros beetle, a really good incident command system was set up to deal with that species, and it's kept it contained to the area around Pearl Harbor. And then the other species I wanted to mention is actually an example of when we didn't use incident command system early enough, and that's little fire ant. So that species arrived on the Big Island in the late 90s. And by the time it was detected, it was kind of assumed, this thing's established, we're really not going to get rid of it. And so it was kind of not ignored, but not responded to with the same organization that we've seen for coconut rhinoceros beetle and for rabbit ohia death. And so that species is now firmly established on our Big Island. It keeps showing up on the other islands in the state. And when it has shown up on those other islands, we have had the opportunity now to kind of revisit how do we deal with that new detection. So on Oahu, it was detected at the end of 2013, population in the central district of the island. And we used kind of a soft ICS system of partners to deal with that infestation. And 5 years later, we consider that population eradicated. So it's certainly possible to still achieve extirpations with ICS, even if the species can no longer be removed from the state. But I think it's been a really valuable lesson for us to contrast how we've responded to species in the past that we're still dealing with now, and then revisiting our response structure to deal with it at a county level rather than a state level. So that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of our structure and response capacity for now, and I think I'll turn it over to the other speaker and answer questions later. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. Perfect. Our final panelist is Hans Bodenhamer with the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto. Hans.
So I'm a high school teacher, so this is a really different venue for me. I got to tell you guys right now, you're far too well behaved. Anyways, I asked if I could show slides because I think slides tell a better story, and this is really a good story. This is a story about an unlikely partnership that formed between government agencies and recreational cavers. This story starts as white nose syndrome starts to spread towards Montana. Most of you probably know all this, but white nose syndrome is a disease, a fungal disease that's killed millions of bats. It attacks their skin, causing irritation, which can wake them up from hibernation and lead to starvation. White nose syndrome was first detected in New York in 2006. It was probably introduced from Europe. It quickly spread through the eastern states and then more slowly towards the west. It's now knocking at our door in Wyoming with the most recent detection. In mid-2010, the Region 2 of the U.S. Forest Service closed all their caves to recreational caving. This resulted in an incredibly prickly relationship between land managers and recreational cavers. Also in 2002, Region 1 of the U.S. Forest Service, which includes Montana, considered closing their caves to recreational cavers. This would have resulted in a likewise prickly relationship. Government agencies concerned with bats in the state are best represented by the Montana Bat Working Group, which is a coalition of specialists from about 10 different agencies. Their primary mission is to conserve and monitor bat populations. Recreational caving groups in the state include the Big Fork High School Cave Club, of which I'm a sponsor, and the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto, of which I'm a member. Both of the caving groups have a strong emphasis on conservation. Note that all of these groups were formed prior to the detection of white nose syndrome in the United States, and all of them have a relatively small membership. In late 2010, the Montana Bat Working Group invited members of the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto and Big Fork High School Cave Club to one of their meetings. What was potentially going to be a very hostile encounter evolved into a wonderful partnership. Cavers realized that if they wanted to continue caving and the Forest Service closed their caves, they'd have to become outlaws, and they weren't really into being outlaws. And wildlife biologists realized that they really didn't know much about the state's cave resources, nor did they have the skills to access many of the caves. So cavers started inviting wildlife biologists caving, and wildlife biologists started taking cavers out on bat surveys. And by 2013, they formalized their partnership in a written agreement. This partnership involved the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto and the Big Fork High School Cave Club in some activities that I think exemplify the best of citizen science. This is a map that shows the location of temperature measurements, data loggers, roosting bats, and soil samples in a cave. This is a map that was produced by one of my students. It was part of a report. My students submitted probably 20-some reports to different federal agencies or government agencies, and the Grotto probably produced about 50 such reports. This is another map produced by one of my students. It shows the location of hibernating bats and bat guano density in a cave. In general, there's no direct correlation between hibernating bats and guano, but it seems like the caves that have a lot of guano are also important hibernacula. My students were also involved in collecting bat guano for DNA analysis. The Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto and Big Fork High School Cave Club provided training and assistance for wildlife biologists to access caves. The Grotto and Cave Club also helped set up mobile labs in caves to sample bats for the fungus and also DNA. The Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto, working in partnership with the agencies, developed and installed a number of bat conservation signs at the entrances of caves. They also deployed a number of visitor registers, which track human visitation to the caves and also have a strong conservation message. This map, also created by one of my students, shows the location of caves with bat conservation signs and registers throughout the state. Probably one of the more interesting and fun things that the Grotto and Cave Club were involved in was detecting previously unrecorded bat hibernacula. These are two hibernating Townsend's big-eared bats in a cave near Columbia Falls. Locating the bats in the caves is really meticulous work. You can see 3 little fuzzy dots on the wall behind the student here that are hibernating bats. Between the Grotto and the Cave Club, the two groups probably post-hold and snowshoed over 1,000 miles to locate previously unrecorded hibernaculum. This is a map also created by one of my students that shows the location of hibernacula recorded before and after 2010. Blue dots are those that were recorded before 2010. Red dots were ones that were recorded by Big Fork High School Cave Club. Orange dots, the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto, and green dots by agency folks. The Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto mandates that all of their members decontaminate their gear prior to any caving trips. They also, on their website, maintain a list of closed caves and caves that are closed seasonally on a voluntary basis. This list was developed in partnership with the different partnering agencies. At Big Fork High School, after every cave trip, we have what we call a decon party. Hard surface things like helmets are decontaminated with antimicrobial spray. More fragile things like cameras and infrared thermometers are decontaminated with Clorox wipes. The vertical gear, which we don't want to put any strange chemicals on, we decontaminate with hot water. One of the other projects my students are more recently involved on is developing what we call eCave, which works something like eBird, where cavers that have access to the site can enter their data and put their bat observations and other conservation notes directly on a map of the cave. And this would be accessible to other cavers that are participating and all the partnering agencies. Couple of thoughts in closing. This map shows the human visitation to caves throughout the states. If you overlay this with the important hibernacula, you can see that there's some potential conflicts. Also, it becomes obvious that a lot of the people that are visiting caves in the state aren't members of the Big Fork High School Cave Club or Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto. There's cavers and cavers. I think this is going to lead to additional partnerships, as we're probably going to have to come to some agreement on installing gates on a few critical hibernacula and working with the agencies and the grottos and the cave club to decide how those will be accessed through keys and at what time of year and decontamination procedures. Last thought, this has been an incredible experience for my students, probably education at its finest. My students have become stewards of the land. They're intellectually involved in solving real-world problems, and they're developing important career-ready skills. And probably the most important thing is they realize that they're doing work that benefits these agencies, which is incredibly motivating. In closing, this partnership between government agencies and recreational cavers sort of transcends policies and regulations. It's about people with really dramatically different perspectives coming together to solve a common problem. This is just a list of a few of the people that I consider really heroes in developing this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. A very fascinating program. Excellent. So thank you to all of our panelists. I'd like to ask a general question first, and then hopefully we will have some time to open it up to the floor. But first of all, to all the panelists, if you have a standout example of various partners where you responded efficiently and effectively to a new species detection, and what funding sources you had to rely on, and if there was any barriers, regulatory barriers, that slowed those efforts. So any great standout examples, if you'd like to share, of an efficient and effective new detection response. John? First. Oh, I think John has.
Okay. You can tell I have an idea.
Yeah, you had an idea.
Okay.
Yep, go for it.
They don't come very often, so I have to emphasize them. So in response to CWD, I mean, we did have, as I mentioned, the partnership with DPHHS, Department of Human Health and Safety, and also with the Department of Livestock. So that was a very important partnership that we had. We also formed partnerships or understandings with non-government agents or non-government organizations such as the Mule Deer Foundation, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Montana Outfitters and Guides. It was very important that we get those people on board so that they understood what the risks were and what needed to be done to respond to CWD. And as I mentioned, the outreach that we did to the public was also important. So working with news agencies, newspapers, those kinds of things. We did a tremendous amount of outreach to our public through news releases, newspapers, radio, TV, those kinds of things. And so those kinds of partnerships are very, very important. Not only the government agencies that I mentioned, but the non-government organizations that are very important in these kinds of things. It was interesting to me because when we first found CWD, we needed to respond to it, and we frankly, didn't have the money. We, being Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, didn't have the money to set up the check stations and whatnot to respond to it. And so I just got on the phone and I called Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, I called Mule Deer Foundation. Can you pony up $10,000 to $20,000 a piece to help us respond to this, to hire staff to man the check stations, those kinds of things? And just like that, they cut through the red tape that they needed to, and we got the money from them. So it was, to me, it was a great example of the sportsmen and women and those people that are interested in our wildlife stepping up with the money that we needed to respond to it. And also, I can't emphasize enough the help and the association that we have with the DPHHS and Department of Livestock, because certainly livestock producers, although it has never been shown that CWD affects any livestock, it can, there's possibility that it somehow could affect those producers in one way or another. And so it was very important that we had livestock and DPHHS on board as well. So those kinds of partnerships are very important. Funding-wise, of course, this CWD is not like a forest fire or outbreak of some other disease that can spread very rapidly. It's a slow-moving disease, and it affects populations in a slow manner. So we do also use incident command structure, but it's kind of a glacial speed rather than working at to address a forest fire. But we use that, and the funding to date has come from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and from a grant that we also got from WAFA, which is the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. But moving forward, I know that we're going to be having to look for other funding, either from the legislature or somehow, because unfortunately we know that we will be finding more of it here in Montana, and looking for and responding to it costs money, and it takes staff to do that. So forming those kinds of partnerships are important.
Go ahead, Josh.
I already mentioned the rapid ohia death response in Hawaii on the Big Island, but mostly in the terms of capacity for finding new infestations in the forest. So I also wanted to mention that one of the really incredible things that happened quickly with that response was the regulatory side. And so our Department of Agriculture in Hawaii enacted a quarantine, I think in record speed, for ohia products and logs and soil moving off of Big Island going to other islands in the state. So that's been a really big part of it. There was some pushback when they were enacting that quarantine, and so the willingness of the department to step up and do that, I think, really helped. They have intercepted the fungus in shipments that have been stopped at the border, and so we know that that quarantine has contributed to at least slowing the spread of the fungus in the state. I also wanted to mention that some of the coordinating capacity for that response has come from the State Department of Land and Natural Resources. They lead these monthly coordinating calls amongst all the different agencies that are working on the problem, and then they additionally have a science working group. The call to action for this response really came from a group of federal and state scientists working in the Hilo area through USDA ARS, Forest Service, and the University of Hawaii. And so having that science backing, I think, has really helped make a credible case for funding. And so the funding we get for that response is a mixture of federal funds, private funding, and then the state legislature has actually provided specific funding for that response for the last 3 years, and I think that'll continue into the future. So where each agency gets their base budget, the Invasive Species Council gets our pot of money to support unique interagency projects, the legislature has provided a line item specifically for rapid ohia death response each year since it was detected. So that's been really helpful.
I have a history of trying to build good partnerships, and that has never been more evident for those that know me than the woman that I married. Me being an entomologist and her hating anything that crawls on the ground on any level. And when I hear Hans talking over there, it also goes to the fact that I have to work in that partnership a little bit because I'm building a cabin, and I really want to put a bat house on the side to encourage bats to come around and eat the insects, and she has yet to agree with that yet. So this moving at glacial speed communication is going to occur over that issue. But all of that being said, APHIS does have a very good success story that we've been celebrating here recently, and that's the European grapevine moth in California. And just a little history, in 2009, it was a moth that was found in the grape crops, which are worth $4 billion, that's with a B, dollars annually in California, which contribute beyond just the grapes themselves to $57 billion in California annually. It's a pretty big deal. And what APHIS did is what we're supposed to do, is that we partnered with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. In California, they have a very robust county ag system. Probably the biggest key partnership in the whole success of this story is that industry got on board and they were part of the solution. They did all the treatments. We convened a technical working group that provided information by which the decision makers can pull from that went all the way to Italy. No, I didn't get that right. Yeah, Italy and Chile. We had experts that had the pest in those areas. We pulled that together. We had a very good public outreach that got the community and the industry involved. And over the course of from 2009 until I think last year, I think it was just within the last year, we actually declared it eradicated. And it was found up into 11 counties right after they found it. It wasn't just a small forest fire. It had spread to 11 different counties in California. But because all those partnerships came together and jointly worked towards one common goal, and we all agreed to what our roles were and we all contributed to it, it was a success, and it's been eradicated. So I think that's kind of the poster child for APHIS's success story, is working together with the people that are affected and being successful. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a specific question to Hans, and then hopefully we'll have some time to get an audience question. So Hans, caving seems inherently dangerous. How did you convince your school to allow you to create a caving club? And also the second part of that, also it seems like a great way to involve students and improve their education. What suggestions do you have to agencies interested in recruiting high school groups to help with invasive species detection and control?
Wow. Well, way back when we thought we ought to have this caving club, I took some students who went before the school board, and they thought, wow, this is real exciting. Then one school board member looked a little puzzled, and he said, is this dangerous? And I said, no more than football, so they approved it. So in terms of getting other schools involved, which I'd really suggest you consider, there's a lot of kids that need this kind of thing. Look for schools maybe that teach a GIS class. They're jonesing for projects where they can put in a lot of data. There's free GIS to all these schools out there. Funding helps too, if you've got some of that laying around. We've gotten some really good support from the BLM, Forest Service, and the Park Service.
Great, thanks Hans. Do we have any questions from the audience? Great, Hillary? You can wait for a microphone and we'll come to you in just a moment. And if you could state your name and affiliation, that would be super.
Sure, Hillary Smith, DOI. So thank you all so much for your remarks. A number of you mentioned the importance of incident command system, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you decide when to use ICS. Is it all new and emerging species, or a type of detection, or something like that?
The incident command system is highly flexible. I think that's one of the things that people don't understand, is that you can use it. If one person responds to a car wreck, they can use the incident command system, which basically means you come up with your objectives, you have a plan, and you implement them. So when you say ICS, it can be used scalable on any level. So within APHIS, we've always used it before it was called ICS. We always had operations, we always had the finance section, we always had all those components, but it really wasn't as structured as formally as what we consider the ICS structure to be now. So really, in my short answer, which is already too long, is that we always use it, but it's very tailored to the situation. When I talk about an incident management team going, that's kind of the highest level, is that you pull in a team from the outside. They have a very formal structure. We draw and pull from the local community and the other responders and stakeholders to be part of that structure. But anything, any kind of response that we do from, this isn't an invasive species issue, but in Montana we suppress grasshoppers, a native pest, and we actually use the incident command system to try to move through that process just to make, make it a little more orderly. So the short answer is we can use it at any level to the degree that it's needed, and we use it most of the time. That's my answer.
Yeah, my answer is that we don't have an answer in Hawaii, and I wish we did. I think that's something we're working towards, is figuring out in which situations an ICS will be triggered. I like what Gary's saying about it being a really flexible system, and so we are working it into some of our planning processes that are, as I mentioned, sort of more hypothetical, and they're sort of on the shelf ready to go when we need them. But what we don't yet have is a sense of, is this tied to a formal action by the state, like a governor declaration of an emergency? And so there has been a little bit of looking around the room when some of these new species detections have happened, and we're saying, well, is this an emergency? Is that a political choice, or is it a biological decision? And we don't yet have guidelines on that, but I think that's something that we're working towards in Hawaii as we become more familiar with and more reliant on ICS.
I guess I would just add that for Montana, as far as CWD goes, it is written right into our plan that for any new detection of CWD in the state, we would initiate a ICS program there, and it also says that the regional supervisor for the region in which it's found will be the incident commander, and then he and she have the team. It specifies who would be on the team to respond to it, those kinds of things. In fact, we just found a new detection of it here in Montana just a couple of days ago. I have a call this afternoon that we will be initiating that. CWD is a disease that we can best find in dead animals, and so we rely on hunter-harvested animals to determine when and where it is. And so we may, in this case, wait until after the end of hunting season, because we are unfortunately unlikely to find more of it in the state as the hunting season progresses. But so we are responding. The plan lays out who, what, when, where, how everything is done.
Question in the back.
Yeah, is this on? Hi, I'm Chip Weber. I'm the Forest Supervisor on the Flathead National Forest and representing Region 1 of the Forest Service at this meeting. This is for Hans. First a comment and then a question. First of all, thank you. We have the good fortune to be one of the partners with the Big Fork Club. And I guess the comment is we talk an awful lot about shared stewardship these days with the states, with the governors, and with their staffs. We've been sharing stewardship of the cave resource on the Flathead National Forest with the Grotto and particularly with the Big Fork Cave Club for a while, and it's the only way that we can get done the kind of monitoring we do. So a big thanks for that. And then my question, and this comes from your slide of the I Heart New York person. The visitors from out of state, I had the good fortune to work with the Indiana Grotto when I was on the Hoosier National Forest. But my question is there a network in place among the grottos across states that is taking up this issue and trying to get after the very problem you cited, which is you're visiting other states and sort of getting a culture of decontamination and caution around this?
This summer in Helena, they had the National Speleological Convention. Cavers from all over the states came. And I'm hoping this will answer your question, but they had the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto before the convention began, stockpiled a large amount of loner gear, helmets, vertical gear, lights, all the stuff that you'd need to go into a cave, so that people that were visiting from white nose infected states or even just other states that were in question could borrow this gear and use this gear. And I'd say within the National Speleological Society, which is the umbrella organization over all the individual grottos, there's a big, strong understanding about decontamination. However, there are probably a lot of people that are going in caves that aren't affiliated with the grottos and such like that. And I think that's going to evolve into some other partnerships that are going to spread the word to these non-affiliated people through educational things. And also, I think we're just going to need to put some more gates. And this is kind of a prickly idea, but maybe put some of the grottos in charge of the keys and making sure people decontaminate and they're in there at the right time. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Oh, we have one up front here.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for a very informative panel. I had a question specifically for John. Oh, I'm Tony Shonen with the Boone and Crockett Club out of Missoula. We're a big game conservation group over there. For John, and maybe anybody else that has some input, Josh mentioned I guess my question is, was there any preventative measures incorporated in the plan that you guys developed around CWD? You know, Josh mentioned quarantine. Was there any kind of a preventative measure like to prevent the spread of CWD as a part of that plan?
Yes, thank you, Tony, for that good question, because it does actually in state statute in Montana and many other states, there are transport restrictions as far as what can be transported from one state to another. In Montana, we also have that. The CWD concentrates mostly in the brain tissue and spinal column. It can be found in all tissues, but mostly in the brain tissue and the spinal column. So there are restrictions on transporting those parts from animals from CWD positive states to other states. Many states have restrictions on that. For example, Montana is a CWD positive state, so you can't legally take those portions of those animals to many other states. Likewise, you can't transport those parts from other CWD positive states into Montana. In addition to that, now that we have some CWD positive areas in the state, we have similar restrictions on transport within Montana. So you can't take those portions from a CWD positive area, for example, the one in Carbon County in southern Montana. You can't take those portions of animals to any other place in the state. We have a transport restriction zone that is a couple of counties that you can take that within there so that you have access to a taxidermist or a processor, something like that. And so we do have those kinds of things. Also, if you have an animal that was harvested in one of those CWD positive areas, we recommend that it be any of the waste be deposited in a Class 2 landfill, and we worked with DEQ, another cooperating agency, on identifying where those landfills are. So we have taken those precautions, and that is actually in statute, that we just copied that right out of statute.
Great, thank you. I would like to take a moment and just thank all of our panelists today for all the information, so thank you.